The trapdoor's lock turned with a sigh, and as it opened, Gideon saw stars that burned with faces, staring back through the dark. But that was yet to come. First, there was the letter. Gideon Blackwood had been a locksmith for 37 years. His fingers grown wise to the secrets that metal held in the coastal village of Thornwick, where salt spray kissed every doorframe and the lighthouse keeper's daughter sang mournful songs at twilight. His reputation was as solid as the granite cliffs that held their world above the churning sea. When locks grew stubborn, when keys broke in ancient doors, when mysteries lay sealed behind iron and brass, the villagers came to Gideon. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by the usual postman, but by a thin woman in a traveling coat who knocked once and disappeared into the mist before Gideon could thank her. The envelope bore no return address, only his name written in spidery script that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. Inside, the message was, "Brief, Mr. Blackwood. Your services are required at Stellaris Observatory on Crow's Point. A gate needs opening. The usual payment, plus consideration for discretion. Come at sunset." Meridian Gideon turned the letter over in his weathered hands. Stellaris Observatory. He knew of it. Of course, everyone in Thornwick did. It perched on the northernmost cliff like a great stone eye, its dome long since cracked and its telescope silent. Built by the eccentric astronomer Elias Meridian in 1887, it had operated for only 12 years before being abandoned under circumstances the villagers preferred not to discuss. Some said a star had vanished from the sky the night the observatory closed. Others whispered that Meridian had seen something through his telescope that drove him mad. The locals had learned, over the decades, that some mysteries were better left buried. But Gideon was a practical man, and practical men paid their bills. The observatory's isolation meant the job would likely be simple rusted hinges, seized mechanisms, the ordinary failures that time visited upon metal and stone. He folded the letter, slipped it into his vest pocket, and spent the day preparing his tools as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Gideon loaded his leather satchel with picks, files, and oils. His fingers, gnarled from years of delicate work, moved with practiced efficiency as he selected each implement. Lockpicks thin as needles, tension wrenches worn smooth by countless use, bottles of lubricant that could coax movement from the most stubborn mechanisms. Everything a locksmith might need for an ordinary job. The path to Crow's Point wound upward through stands of twisted pine and gorse, their branches shaped by decades of salt wind into strange, reaching forms. As Gideon climbed, the village fell. Away below him, its warm windows growing small and distant. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening water in its eternal rhythm, a comfort that seemed to fade with each step he took away from the safety of inhabited places. Stellaris Observatory emerged from the mist like something from a dream. Its stone walls, blackened by weather and time, rose in perfect circles toward the damaged dome. Gothic windows stared down at him, their glass long since broken, and ivy climbed the walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the building were slowly being claimed by something that understood the value of patience. The main entrance stood open, its heavy wooden doors sagging on their hinges. No light showed within, but someone expected him the letter had been quite specific about the time. Gideon stepped across the threshold, his footsteps echoing in the circular chamber beyond. The interior of the observatory was a study in elegant decay. Brass fixtures, tarnished green with age, still held their positions along the walls. Bookshelves, many empty, but some still holding volumes whose leather bindings cracked at the touch of air, lined the lower level. A spiral staircase, its iron treads worn smooth, led upward to where the great telescope waited in darkness. Mr. Blackwood. The voice came from the shadows near the staircase, and Gideon turned to see a figure step into the pale light that filtered through the broken dome. The man was tall and spare, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable 40 years ago. His hair was silver white, his eyes the color of winter sky, and when he moved, he seemed to disturb the air itself, as if he were slightly out of phase with the world around him. Mr. Meridian, I presume? Gideon extended his hand, but the man merely nodded. Indeed, though I confess, time moves strangely here. I sometimes forget which generation I belong to. Meridian's smile was thin and distant. Thank you for coming. The matter is, delicate. He led Gideon up the spiral stairs, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The upper chamber housed the telescope, a magnificent instrument of brass and steel that dominated the space. Its lens, cracked, but still intact, pointed upward through the broken dome toward the first stars of evening. The gate is here, Meridian said, gesturing toward what appeared to be an empty section of floor beneath the telescope's base. It was sealed long ago, for good reason. Gideon knelt and examined the stones. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just worn flagstones, fitted together with the precision of master craftsmen. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out the subtle differences in color and texture that marked the edges of a hidden door. A trap door, perhaps 3 feet square, set flush with the floor and sealed with a lock mechanism so cunningly concealed that only trained eyes would notice it. What's below? Gideon asked, running his fingers along the almost invisible seam. Knowledge, Meridian replied, the kind that changes a man, the kind that follows him home and whispers in his sleep. He paused, his winter eyes reflecting the starlight that filtered through the dome. My ancestor built this place to study the heavens. He found more than stars up there. Gideon's practical nature rebelled against such mystical talk, but something in Meridian's voice gave him pause. The man spoke with the careful precision of someone who had learned to weigh every word, someone who understood the power that language could hold. Why open it now? Gideon asked. Because it's time, Meridian said simply. Because some doors, once sealed, develop a pressure behind them, and pressure, Mr. Blackwood, eventually finds a way to equalize itself. The lock mechanism, when Gideon finally located it, was unlike anything he had encountered in his 37 years of practice. It was worked into the stone itself, a series of rotating discs and sliding pins that seemed to follow no earthly logic. The metal was neither brass nor iron, but something that felt warm to the touch, as if it held its own internal fire as he worked. Gideon became aware of changes in the observatory around him. The shadows seemed deeper, the broken dome more vast. The telescope, though pointing at the sky, gave the impression of watching him instead. its cracked lens reflecting his movements in fragments. And from somewhere far below, barely at the edge of hearing, came a sound like singing voices, too distant to understand, too beautiful to ignore. His picks slid into the mechanism with surprising ease, as if the lock wanted to be opened. Each tumbler fell into place with a soft chime, a musical note that harmonized with the singing from below. The work that should have taken hours required only minutes, and with each small victory, Gideon felt a growing unease. "There," he said, as the final pin slid home. "It's open." Meridian nodded, his face grave. "Yes, now comes the difficult part, which is deciding whether to lift it." The trapdoor trembled beneath their feet, as if something below were testing its boundaries. A thin line of light, not golden, like sunlight, or silver like moonbeams, but something altogether alien seeped around the edges. The singing grew louder, resolving into harmonies that human throats had never shaped. "What's down there?" Gideon asked again, though part of him no longer wanted to know. "The stars," Meridian whispered, "the real stars, the ones that watch us back." And with those words hanging in the air, like a prayer or a curse, the trapdoor began to open on its own. The trapdoor rose with a whisper of ancient hinges, revealing not the dark cellar Gideon had expected, but a shaft of impossible depth filled with swirling light. The illumination was wrong, too bright and too dim at once, casting shadows that fell upward and reflections that showed things that weren't there. As the opening widened, the singing voices became clearer, though no more comprehensible, weaving melodies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the bones. "My God," Gideon breathed, stepping back from the edge. But Meridian caught his arm with fingers that felt as cold as winter stone. "Not God," the man said quietly. "Something far older, something that was watching when the first light learned to burn." Below them, the shaft descended through layers of stone and earth, but also through something else, spaces between spaces, where geometry bent according to rules that predated human understanding. Spiraling stairs, carved from the same warm metal as the lock mechanism, led down into the light. Each step seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a heartbeat made of starfire and ancient longing. "Your ancestor built this?" Gideon asked, his voice barely audible above the ethereal chorus rising from the depths. "He found it," Meridian corrected. "The observatory was built around it, over it, to contain it. Elias thought he could study what lay beneath, learn its secrets without becoming part of them. He was wrong." The light pulsed, and in that pulse, Gideon glimpsed shapes, moving in the depths, not quite human, not quite stellar, but something that partook of both. They seemed to notice his attention, turning toward him with faces that burned like distant suns. Their eyes held the cold fire of space, and when they looked at him, he felt himself measured and found ... interesting. "We should close it," Gideon said, though his hand was already reaching toward the stairs. The metal felt warm beneath his palm, almost welcoming. "This isn't meant for us." "Perhaps not," Meridian agreed, "but it calls nonetheless. And some calls, Mr. Blackwood, become impossible to ignore once they've been heard." The singing voices shifted their harmony, and suddenly the melody was familiar lullaby Gideon's mother had sung to him as a child, though the words had been different then. Now the song spoke of distances beyond measure, of light that traveled. So far it forgot its own source, of eyes that opened in the darkness between worlds, to watch and wait and remember. Just a quick look, Gideon heard himself saying, to understand what we're dealing with. Meridian's smile was sad and knowing. That's what Elias said. That's what they all say in the end. But Gideon was already descending, his locksmith's hands tracing the smooth curve of the metal railings, his practical mind struggling to catalog and comprehend what he saw. Each step down brought new impossibilities, walls that extended infinitely in directions that didn't exist, chambers that occupied the same space without touching, distances that grew shorter as they lengthened. The stairs descended through what might have been the earth's crust, though the stone here was crystalline and filled with veins of that warm, pulsing light. Strange machines, or perhaps organs, lined the walls, their purpose unclear, but their activity undeniable. They hummed and whispered and sang, contributing their voices to the endless chorus that filled the shaft. Elias called it the Observatory. Inferior. Meridian's voice drifted down from above. Though when Gideon looked up, he could no longer see the opening through which they'd entered, the place where heaven watches earth, where the stars keep their vigil. A chamber opened to Gideon, left, its entrance marked by symbols that hurt to look at directly. Within, he glimpsed what might have been a library, its shelves holding not books but crystalline structures that pulsed with contained knowledge. Some were dark, their secrets dormant, while others blazed with light too bright to bear. At the chamber's center sat a figure hunched over a desk, writing with instruments that left trails of fire in the air. Elias, Gideon called, but the figure didn't respond. It continued its work with the single-minded devotion of one who had found his true calling and would pursue it until the end of time. He's been writing the same equation for 73 years, Meridian said, his voice now coming from beside Gideon, though the man himself was nowhere to be seen. The formula that describes how observation changes the observed, how watching something closely enough transforms both the watcher and the watched. Gideon continued his descent, drawn by the promise of understanding that seemed to hover just beyond each turn of the spiral stairs. The singing grew more complex, voices joining and separating in harmonies that spoke of vast distances and patient observation. Sometimes the melodies would resolve into something almost human, a mother's lullaby, a lover's whisper, a child's counting song before dissolving back into cosmic music that had no earthly counterpart. The air grew thinner and thicker at once, carrying scents that belonged to no terrestrial flower, ozone and starlight. The metallic taste of comets, the sweet decay of civilizations that had fallen while their light was still traveling toward distant eyes. Gideon's lungs adapted without his conscious will, drawing sustenance from atmospheres that should have killed him. At the 10th turn of the stairs, or perhaps the 100th, for counting had become problematic, Gideon found himself in a vast chamber whose ceiling stretched up into darkness, while its floor extended beyond the reach of the strange light that emanated from everything and nothing. The space was filled with instruments of observation, telescopes that pointed not outward but inward, mirrors that reflected not light but intention, lenses that focused not images but possibilities. And everywhere, the watchers, they were tall and graceful, their forms suggesting humanity while definitively transcending it. Their skin held the deep blue black of space itself, scattered with points of light that pulsed in rhythm with their thoughts. Their eyes were stars, not metaphorically, but literally burning with the cold fire of distant suns, ancient beyond measure, yet eternally present. One of them turned toward Gideon, and when it spoke, its voice was the whisper of solar wind across planetary rings. "Locksmith," it said, and the word contained multitudes, every lock he had ever opened, every secret he had revealed, every barrier he had overcome. "You have opened the way between watching and being watched." "I don't understand," Gideon said, though part of him was beginning to. "Understanding is not required," another watcher replied, its stellar eyes blazing with gentle amusement. "Only participation. You have called our attention to your world, as was always intended. Now we shall watch it more closely." The chamber filled with the sound of great mechanisms, engaging cosmic clockwork that had waited eons for this moment. Through the transparent walls for all surfaces, here seemed to be windows into elsewhere. Gideon saw his own world spread out below like a map drawn in light. Thornwick Village, small and precious, glowed with the warmth of human lives. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal circle, marking time in a universe that had suddenly become far less lonely. "What do you want?" Gideon asked. "To observe," the first watcher said simply. "To catalog, to remember. Your species has reached the threshold where it begins to look outward with true sight. We have been waiting for this moment since your sun first learned to burn. And if we don't want to be watched." The watcher's stellar laughter was like the sound of aurora singing in polar skies. "Want is irrelevant, Locksmith. You have opened the door between realms. The watching has already begun." As if in response to their words, the instruments around the chamber began to activate. Telescopes turned toward viewing ports that showed not distant galaxies, but intimate scenes from the world above. Families gathering for dinner, children playing in gardens, lovers meeting in secret places. The watchers positioned themselves at the various instruments with the practiced ease of those who had been waiting a very long time to resume their work. "Every lock you open now," one of them said to Gideon, not unkindly, "will also open here. Every secret you reveal will become part of our catalog. Every door you unseal will grant us deeper access to the world you call home." Gideon felt the weight of what he had done settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of starlight and regret. "How do I close it? How do I undo what I've opened?" "You cannot," Meridian said, and Gideon turned to see the man standing beside him, though his form was now translucent and filled with the same warm light that pulsed through the chamber's walls. "But you can choose how to live with it." Elias tried to fight the connection and lost himself completely. "I accepted it and found a different kind of existence. You, Locksmith, must find your own path between revelation and concealment." The singing reached a crescendo, and suddenly Gideon was moving upward through the shaft, not climbing but rising like a bubble through water made of light. The watcher's chamber fell away below him, though their stellar eyes remained fixed on his retreating form. The crystalline libraries and impossible machines blurred past, and the figure of Elias continued writing at his desk, recording observations in characters that burned themselves into the air. He emerged through the trapdoor into the observatory's upper chamber, gasping and shaking, his hands clutching at solid stone to anchor himself in a world that suddenly felt fragile and transparent. The trapdoor sealed itself with a sigh, becoming invisible once again among the flagstones, though Gideon could still feel the warmth of that alien light pulsing beneath his feet. The night sky, visible through the broken dome, looked different now. The stars no longer seemed distant and cold, but present and aware, their light carrying messages he was only beginning to understand. And in his peripheral vision, just at the edge of sight, he could glimpse the Watcher's instruments turning toward Earth with patient, eternal attention. Gideon descended from Crow's Point in the deep hours of night, when the world lay wrapped in darkness, and the only sounds were the distant crash of waves against the cliffs and the soft whisper of wind through the gorse. The path seemed longer than it had during his ascent, winding through shadows that moved independently of their casting objects and past trees whose branches reached toward him with what felt like deliberate intent. His hands shook as he walked, not from cold, but from the memory of starlight that still pulsed beneath his skin. When he held them up to examine them in the pale moonlight, he could see veins of faint luminescence tracing patterns across his palm's constellation maps, written in his own flesh, marking him as surely as if he'd been branded. The village of Thornwick lay sleeping below him, its windows dark, save for the lighthouse that continued its eternal sweep across the harbor. The sight of it should have been comforting, a return to the familiar world of human scale and human concerns. Instead, Gideon found himself seeing it as the Watchers must see at a collection of tiny lights harboring smaller lives, precious and fragile and utterly exposed to observation from the vast darkness above. His cottage sat at the village's edge, a modest stone building with a workshop attached where he pursued his craft. The locksmith's sign that hung beside his door, crossed key and pick carved from driftwood, creaked in the salt breeze. Everything appeared exactly as he had left it hours earlier. Yet somehow the familiar had been transformed into something alien. Gideon's key turned in his own lock with unusual reluctance, the mechanism seeming to resist his entry. When the door finally opened, he stepped into his kitchen and immediately knew something had changed. The air itself felt different, charged with potential, and shadows gathered in corners where shadows had no business being so deep. He lit an oil lamp with trembling fingers, and in its warm glow saw that his cottage was no longer entirely his own. Symbols had appeared on the walls, not carved or painted, but somehow impressed into the very stone, as if the building itself were learning a new language. The marks resembled the constellations he'd seen mapped on his hands, but arranged in patterns that suggested meaning beyond mere stellar positioning. On his kitchen table sat a letter that hadn't been there when he left. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, only his name written in script that seemed to shift when observed directly. Inside, the message was brief. Mr. Blackwood, the work begins now. Every lock you open will serve two purposes. Choose your commissions carefully. The Observatory. Gideon sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Through his cottage window, the lighthouse beam swept past, and for just a moment he saw figures silhouetted in its light tall, graceful forms with eyes like stars, standing motionless. In his garden, when the beam moved on, they vanished, but he could feel their attention lingering like heat from a banked fire. Sleep came eventually, though it brought no rest. His dreams were filled with vast spaces and patient observation. with instruments that measured not distance but intimacy, with voices that sang of secrets hidden in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He woke before dawn with the taste of starlight in his mouth and the certain knowledge that he was no longer alone in his own life. The morning brought Mrs. Calloway, the baker's widow, clutching a rusted padlock that secured her late husband's recipe safe. She stood in Gideon's workshop, wringing her hands, her eyes red from weeping, explaining how the lock had seized during the night, and she couldn't access the formulas for the special breads that kept her bakery profitable. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she pleaded. "It's all I have left of him, and all I have to live on." Gideon examined the lock with hands that still trembled slightly. It was an ordinary mechanism, brass and iron combined, aged but not particularly challenging. Yet, as he prepared his tools, he became aware of observation, not Mrs. Calloway's anxious watching, but something far more comprehensive. The air in his workshop grew thick with attention, and when he glanced toward the windows, he glimpsed the reflection of stellar eyes watching his every movement. His picks slid into the lock with practiced ease, and as each tumbler fell into place, he felt a corresponding shift in the fabric of observation around him. With the final click, the padlock opened, but something else opened, with a tay window through which distant eyes could peer more closely into Mrs. Calloway's private world. As she hurried away with her precious recipes, Gideon saw translucent figures following in her wake, their stellar gazes cataloging every secret the safe had contained. The pattern repeated throughout the day. Mr. Henley brought a music box that had belonged to his daughter, its tiny lock frozen by grief and salt air. Miss Thornfield arrived with a jewelry case she'd inherited from her aunt, sealed for 20 years, and holding letters that might explain why the old woman had never married. Young Tom Fletcher sheepishly presented a trunk from his grandmother's attic, locked since her death and rumored to contain treasures from her mysterious past. Each lock that yielded to Gideon's skill opened something more than a mechanical barrier. With every turn of his picks, every tumbler that fell into place, the veil between Thornwick and the observatory grew thinner. The watcher's attention penetrated deeper into the village's private spaces, cataloging secrets with the patient thoroughness of those who measure time in geological epochs. By evening, Gideon could see them clearly, tall figures moving through the village streets like living constellations, invisible to everyone but him. They peered through windows, stood beside beds where lovers whispered, observed children at play with the detached interest of naturalists studying an exotic species. Their presence wasn't malevolent, exactly, but it was absolute. Nothing in Thornwick now escaped their notice. The lighthouse keeper, old Samuel Morse, arrived just as Gideon was preparing to close his workshop. He carried a brass chest covered in green verdigris, its lock mechanism corroded by decades of salt spray and neglect. "Found this in the lighthouse foundation," Samuel explained, his weathered face troubled. "Been there since before my grandfather's time, sealed in a niche in the stone. The mortars finally crumbled enough to work it free." Gideon accepted the chest reluctantly. It was heavier than it appeared, and warm to the touch despite having been buried in cold stone. Strange symbols decorated its surface, not the stellar constellations he'd grown familiar with, but something older, more terrestrial, yet equally mysterious. "What do you think it contains?" he asked. Samuel shrugged. could be anything. Records from the old keepers, maybe, or treasure from a wreck. The lighthouse has been here for 2 centuries. It's seen its share of mysteries come and go. As Gideon's picks found their way into the ancient lock, he became aware of a different kind of attention. The stellar watchers, always present at the periphery of his vision, drew closer. Their normally patient demeanor showing signs of something that might have been curiosity or concern or anticipation. The chest's mechanism was unlike any he'd encountered, not merely aged, but somehow ... expectant. The lock opened with a sound like distant thunder, and immediately the workshop filled with a light that wasn't quite the warm, stellar radiance of the observatory, but something cooler, more blue-green, like phosphorescence from deep ocean trenches. Inside the chest, nestled in rotted silk, lay a collection of objects that defied easy categorization. Shells that spiraled in patterns that hurt to follow. Crystals that held their own internal storms. And a logbook bound in leather that moved, slightly, as if breathing. Samuel reached for the logbook, but his hand passed through it, as if it were made of mist. "Strange," he muttered. "I can see it plain as day, but ... Gideon could touch it, though the leather felt cold and slightly damp beneath his fingers. The pages, when he opened them, were covered in handwriting that shifted between languages and scripts, sometimes within a single sentence. But here and there, passages in familiar English emerged from the polyglot chaos. Day 847 of the Deep Watch. The stars above show interest in our small portion of the shore. We maintain the light, not for ships alone, but as a beacon for those who watch from far places. The compact holds, though the cost grows heavy. Day 1203. They have noticed us at last. The observers from the high places send their instruments and their attention. We must be ready. The choice between watching and being watched approaches. Day 1461. The locksmith comes. It is time to complete the circle, to close what was opened, to balance observation with concealment. The lighthouse will serve a new purpose, or serve none at all. As Gideon read, the stellar watchers pressed closer, their interest now clearly focused on the ancient logbook. But they were not alone. From the chest itself, from the mysterious objects it contained, came another presence holder, more rooted in terrestrial soil and salt spray, guardians who had maintained their vigil while civilizations rose and fell. Around them, the lighthouse beam swept across the workshop window, and in its light, Gideon saw the truth. Thornwick had been watched for far longer than the watchers from above had been aware. There were older observers, maritime guardians, whose attention rose from the depths rather than descending from the stars. The chest contained their instruments, their records, their own patient catalog of human secrets. And now, with the opening of the observatory and the unsealing of the lighthouse's ancient trust, 2 forms of observation were about to meet in the small village of Thornwick. The result, Gideon realized with growing dread, would determine not just who watched whom, but whether anything of his familiar world would survive the encounter. The night sky above Thornwick writhed with tension as 2 forms of ancient observation prepared to meet. From his workshop window, Gideon watched the stellar watchers take positions throughout the village, their luminescent forms creating new constellations against the darkness. But from the harbor came another present shapes that rose from tide pools and emerged from sea caves. beings whose eyes held the cold green light of deep waters and whose movements carried the rhythm of eternal tides. The lighthouse beam, which had swept its predictable arc for over 2 centuries, began to change. Instead of the steady white light that guided ships to safety, it now pulsed with colors that had no names, deep blues that spoke of abyssal trenches, greens that whispered of forests beneath the waves, purples that held the memory of twilight. On alien shores, each pulse seemed to send a message, though in what language or to what recipient, Gideon could only guess. Samuel Morse stood beside him, the ancient chest still open on the workbench between them. The old lighthouse keeper's weathered hands shook as he read from the logbook, his voice barely above a whisper. "My great-grandfather's handwriting," he said, pointing to one of the entries, "and his grandfather's before him. This chest. It's been passed down through the keeper's line, waiting for the night when the watchers from above would finally take notice of our small corner of the world." The maritime guardians moved through Thornwick's streets with fluid grace, their forms shifting between human appearance and something more primal, part seal, part current, part living embodiment of the sea's patient memory. They took positions opposite the stellar watchers, creating a complex geometry of observation that left no corner of the village unmonitored by one faction or the other. "What do they want?" Gideon asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "The same thing the Star Watchers want," Samuel replied, closing the logbook with hands that showed new strength to observe, to catalog, to remember. "But where the ones from above watch with the detachment of distance. Those from the depths watch with the intimacy of tides that have touched every shore, every secret that the sea has ever claimed." Through his cottage window, Gideon saw Mrs. Calloway emerged from her bakery, her arms full of fresh loaves. She walked her normal morning route, delivering bread to the village's early risers, completely unaware that every step was observed by beings whose attention could reshape reality through the simple act of focused observation. A stellar watcher followed her, cataloging the recipes now accessible through the opened safe, while a maritime guardian observed from the shadows, recording the conversations she had with her customers, the small intimacies of community life that the sea had been collecting for centuries. The competing observations began to create distortions in the fabric of everyday life. At the school, children playing in the yard cast shadows that moved independently of their bodiest stellar shadows that fell toward the sky. Maritime shadows that flowed toward the harbor. The village church bell tolled without being rung, its bronze voice carrying harmonies that spoke of both cosmic distances and oceanic depths. Even the wind seemed confused, blowing simultaneously inland and seaward, carrying scents of ozone and brine, starlight and phosphorescence. Gideon felt the change most acutely in his own work. Each lock he had opened during the previous day now served as a conduit between the competing forms of observation. Mrs. Calloway's recipe safe glowed with pale stellar light while simultaneously dripping with brine that shouldn't exist. Mr. Henley's music box played melodies that belonged to no earthly composer, their notes creating ripples in the air that revealed the presence of invisible watchers. Miss Thornfield's jewelry case had become a window through which observers from above and below could peer into human desires with equal intensity. The tension between the two factions of watchers grew throughout the day, manifesting in increasingly obvious ways. The tide came in at the wrong time, reaching heights that would have flooded the lower village if its waters hadn't been simultaneously pulled upward by stellar gravity, creating impossible waterfalls that flowed toward the sky. Shooting stars appeared in broad daylight, their trails intersecting with whale songs that emerged from perfectly clear air. The lighthouse beam began to bend, its light curving around invisible masses as competing forms of attention warped space. Itself, by afternoon, the very air above Thornwick had become a battlefield of observation. Stellar instruments descended like geometric rain, their crystalline forms designed to measure human behavior with cosmic precision. Maritime devices rose from the harbor coral formations that processed secrets, kelp networks that transmitted whispered conversations, shells that preserved human voices for later analysis. The two observation systems began to interfere with each other, creating feedback loops that threatened to tear the small village apart. Gideon found Meridian waiting in his workshop when he returned from his afternoon rounds. The man, or whatever he had become, stood before the opened chest, his translucent form flickering between stellar radiance and oceanic phosphorescence. "It's not sustainable," Meridian said without preamble. "The competing observations are creating resonance patterns that will tear this place apart. The watchers from above see too far. Those from below see too deep. Neither understands the delicate balance required for human life to continue." "What can we do?" Gideon asked, though part of him suspected the answer would require more of him than he was prepared to give. "The same thing keepers have done for centuries," Samuel said, emerging from the shadows where he had been waiting. "Make a choice." The compact that founded this village was built on the understanding that some things must be watched, but watching must be balanced with concealment. The lighthouse has served both purposes, guiding ships safely to shore while hiding certain truths from eyes that weren't ready to see them. The old keeper approached the chest, his movements now showing a grace that spoke of decades spent in communion with forces beyond normal human understanding. Each generation of lighthouse keepers has been prepared for this moment. The night when the watchers from above would notice what the guardians from below have been protecting. The night when someone would have to choose which form of observation would be allowed to continue. "And if I refuse to choose?" Gideon asked. "Then the choice will be made for you," Meridian replied. "And for everyone in Thornwick. The competing observations will either merge, creating something that understands neither stellar distance nor oceanic depth, or they will cancel each other out, leaving this place invisible to all forms of attention. Hidden, perhaps, but also forgotten, cut off from the larger patterns that give meaning to existence." Outside the workshop, the conflict between watchers intensified. A stellar observer attempted to examine the thoughts of young Tom Fletcher as he worked in his grandmother's garden, but a maritime guardian intercepted the observation, creating a feedback loop that left the boy standing motionless, his consciousness caught between cosmic attention and oceanic memory. Similar incidents were occurring throughout the village, people frozen between competing forms of scrutiny, their lives suspended while ancient forces struggled for the right to catalog their secrets. "The locksmith's art," Samuel said, lifting one of the strange objects from the chest, "has always been about more than opening doors. It's about choosing which doors should remain sealed and which watchers should be allowed to see what lies behind them. The object in his hands, a shell that spiraled in patterns that hurt to follow, began to glow with soft phosphorescence. This is a lock of a different kind, one that seals attention itself, that chooses who may observe and who must remain hidden. Gideon understood with the sudden clarity that comes in moments of irreversible decision what was being asked of him. Not simply to choose between the stellar watchers and the maritime guardians, but to become the mechanism by which that choice would be enforced, to transform himself into a living lock, a guardian of observation itself. The cost, he asked. Everything. You've been, Meridian said softly, and everything you might have become. But in exchange, Thornwick continues to exist in the spaces between watching and being watched, hidden when it needs to be hidden, revealed when revelation serves a purpose. The lighthouse beam pulsed once more, and in that pulse, Gideon saw the full scope of what was at stake. Not just his village, but all the small places where human life flourished in the shadows cast by larger forces. Every town with its secrets, every community that had learned to balance revelation with concealment, every lighthouse keeper who had maintained the delicate equilibrium between guidance and hiding. He took the spiral shell from Samuel's hands, feeling its weight, not physical, but the weight of centuries of careful observation, of secrets kept and truths revealed at precisely the right moments. The surface was warm and slightly damp, like something that had recently emerged from deep waters, but it also held the cold fire of distant stars. How do I use it? He asked. The same way you use any lock, Samuel replied, by understanding what it's meant to protect and from whom. The spiral shell felt alive in Gideon's hands, its surface pulsing with rhythms that echoed both the heartbeat of tides and the measured burning of stars. As he held it, knowledge flowed into him, not learned, but remembered, as if he had always known these truths and had simply forgotten them in the noise of ordinary life. He saw the history of Thornwick laid out like a map of light and shadow, generation after generation of lighthouse keepers who had maintained the balance, protecting the village from observation that would have changed it beyond recognition, while allowing just enough scrutiny to keep it connected to the larger patterns of existence. Each keeper had been both guardian and gate, choosing what could be seen and what must remain hidden. The stellar watchers and maritime guardians had drawn closer during the afternoon, their competing forms of attention creating a pressure that made the very air feel thick and strange. Through his workshop window, Gideon could see villagers moving through their daily routines with increasing difficulty, as if walking through water or honey. Mrs. Calloway stood frozen outside her bakery, a loaf of bread halfway to her mouth, caught between a stellar observer cataloging her hunger and a maritime guardian measuring her satisfaction. Young Tom Fletcher remained motionless in his grandmother's garden, his consciousness suspended between cosmic attention and oceanic memory. "It's time," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had been passed down through generations of keepers. "The shell will respond to your locksmith's skills, but you must understand what you're locking and unlocking. Every choice you make will reshape the balance of observation itself." Gideon examined the shell with the careful attention he had given to thousands of locks over the years. Its spiral pattern wasn't merely decorative, but functional. Each curve, and chambers serving as part of a mechanism more complex than any human craftsmanship could achieve. There were openings that led to chambers, that led to other openings, pathways that doubled back on themselves, while somehow still moving forward. Spaces that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The stellar watchers see too much, he said, understanding flooding through him as his fingers found the shell's hidden mechanisms. They observe without discrimination, cataloging everything with equal attention. They would turn Thornwick into a specimen perfectly preserved, but no longer truly alive. And the maritime guardians, Meridian prompted, asterisk. They see too deeply, Gideon replied, his picks now transformed into instruments made of the same warm metal as the observatories, stairs sliding into the shell's impossible mechanisms. They would draw everything into the depths of memory, preserving it so completely that it could never change, never grow, never surprise them. His fingers moved with practiced precision, but this time he was not simply opening or closing a lock. He was adjusting the delicate mechanisms that governed attention itself, choosing which forms of observation would be permitted and which would be gently redirected elsewhere. The first chamber in the shell controlled the Stellar Watcher's instruments. As Gideon's tools found their way into its crystalline mechanisms, he felt the cosmic observer's attention shifting. Instead of focusing on Thornwick's intimate secrets, their great telescopes began to turn toward other concerns, distant galaxies, where civilizations were taking their first steps toward true starfaring young worlds, where life was learning to look up at the night sky and wonder about its place in the universe. Choose wisely, Samuel warned. Redirect their attention to far, and Thornwick becomes invisible to all cosmic observation. We need some connection to the larger universe, some thread that keeps us part of the great pattern. Gideon adjusted the mechanism with careful precision, leaving just enough stellar attention focused on the village to maintain its place in the cosmic catalog while protecting its people from the full weight of observation that would have transformed them from living beings into perfect specimens. The second chamber controlled the maritime guardian's deep-seeing instruments. This mechanism was more fluid, its components shifting like tides as Gideon worked. The guardians from the depths had been cataloging human secrets for so long that they had forgotten the difference between preservation and stagnation. Their attention was so complete, so patient, that it threatened to freeze Thornwick's people in eternal moments of perfect observation as his tools found their way into the oceanic mechanisms. Gideon felt the maritime guardian's attention flowing like water, finding new channels. Instead of focusing on every whispered conversation and private thought, they began to withdraw into the deeper mysteries of the sea itself, the songs of whales that carried messages across ocean basins, the dreams of creatures that lived in trenches so deep that sunlight had never touched them, the slow wisdom of currents that had circled the earth since before humans learned to speak. But some connection remained. The lighthouse beam would still carry their blessing. Ships would still find safe harbor when the sea chose to grant it. And the village's secrets would still be protected by guardians who understood the value of both revelation and concealment. The third chamber was the most complex, for it controlled the balance between the two forms of observation. Here, Gideon's locksmith skills were pushed to their absolute limit as he adjusted mechanisms that existed in dimensions his mind could barely comprehend. Each tiny movement sent ripples through both stellar and oceanic attention, creating harmonies. Where there had been conflict, establishing rhythms that allowed both forms of watching to coexist without destroying what they observed. As he worked, Gideon felt himself changing. The warm light that had pulsed beneath his skin since his descent into the observatory began to stabilize, finding balance with the cold phosphorescence that rose from the maritime guardian's realm. He was becoming something new, not quite human, but not entirely other either. A living lock, a conscious mechanism for regulating observation itself. The shell's final chamber required the greatest sacrifice. To activate it, Gideon had to surrender his own capacity for ordinary vision, trading his human sight for the ability to see the streams of attention that flowed between observer and observed. The world around him dissolved into patterns of light and shadow, currents of scrutiny and tides of concealment. He could no longer see Mrs. Calloway's face, but he could perceive the gentle, stellar attention that catalogued her kindness without diminishing it, the maritime observation that preserved her memories without freezing them in place. Young Tom Fletcher became a dancing intersection of cosmic curiosity and oceanic patience, both forms of watching contributing to his growth rather than constraining it. Throughout Thornwick, the balance settled into place. The village remained visible to both stellar and maritime observation, but the intensity of attention had been carefully regulated. People could live their lives without becoming specimens, could keep their secrets without becoming invisible, could change and grow while still being remembered and catalogued by forces beyond their understanding. The lighthouse beam, now steady, once again swept across the harbor with its familiar rhythm. But those who knew how to see could perceive the subtle differences in its light, the way it sometimes pulsed with stellar fire, sometimes flickered with oceanic phosphorescence, and sometimes simply shone with the warm light of human purpose. Gideon stood in his workshop, no longer fully human, but still recognizably himself, the spiral shell warm in his transformed hands. Through the windows that were now streams of observation rather than simple glass, he could see both forms of watchers taking up their new positions. The stellar watchers maintained their distant vigil, their attention focused on the grand patterns, while leaving space for individual privacy. The maritime guardians settled into their deeper watching, preserving the village's essence while allowing for natural change and growth. Samuel Morse, his duty as keeper finally complete, smiled with the satisfaction of one who had successfully passed an ancient trust to worthy hands. "The balance holds," he said. "Thornwick will continue to exist in the spaces between watching and being watched, guided by a locksmith who understands that some doors are meant to be opened, some are meant to remain closed, and some are meant to be opened and closed in careful rhythm with the tides of attention themselves." As night fell over the village, Gideon took up his new role as guardian of observation itself. When people brought him locks to open, he would see not just the mechanical barriers, but the streams of attention that flowed around them. He would choose, with each turn of his picks, which secrets deserved stellar cataloging and which required oceanic protection, which doors should remain sealed from all forms of watching, and which should be opened to specific types of observation. The work would be subtle, largely invisible to those he protected, but essential to maintaining the delicate balance that allowed human life to flourish under the gaze of forces vast and patient and eternally curious. In the lighthouse beam that swept across the harbor, in the gentle attention of stars that observed without overwhelming, in the protective concealment of tides that remembered without constraining, the village of Thornwick found its place in the great pattern of watching and being watched. And in his workshop by the sea, Gideon Blackwood continued his ancient craft, opening locks and closing them, revealing secrets and concealing others, maintaining the balance between revelation and mystery that made life possible in a universe full of eyes that never closed and memories that never faded. The spiral shell rested on his workbench, its mechanisms humming softly with the rhythm of balanced observation, ready to adjust the flow of attention whenever the balance threatened to tip too far toward scrutiny or concealment. Through windows that were streams of light, Gideon watched over his village with eyes that had learned to see the spaces between watching and being watched. Forever the locksmith who had opened the door between realms and chosen to stand guard at the threshold end.